Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the General Government Committee meeting. Today is Wednesday, October 9th. The time is 8 a.m. and we are all wide awake and ready to get started. We'll call to order, begin with roll call. All three council members are present and accounted for. Councilmember Leila Dolhoff, Councilmember Joe Cathy, and myself, Councilmember Michael Althauser. The first order of business, as always, is approval of minutes from our prior meeting on September 11th, 2024. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second? There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, or motion by Councilmember Dolhoff and seconded by Councilmember Cathy. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you. So we have one item on the agenda today, informational item, our next sort of step in the 2025 comprehensive plan about the housing allocation and land capacity analysis. Brad, are you and Erica gonna help us walk through this one?
Yep, we'll do that. Now, I'm a
Great.
little concerned because expectations obviously are very high since Joan stated before the meeting that this is such an important thing. And also I'm feeling a little chagrined because I only got 10 pounds of tomatoes out of it, but I got some really good soup for the tomatoes. Anyway, the agenda today, we're going to walk you through basically the findings that we have on our housing needs accommodations, as well as the land capacity analysis, which are interrelated. This work is really essential for us moving forward, especially with our land use element and our housing element. So what I'd like to do is just run you through a presentation. Your packet included the final report that will be presented to PRPC this year for their blessing. And then all the jurisdictions in the county will be using that as the basis of their work going forward. So let me make sure I can share screen, or more importantly, everyone can see my screen. So just give me a moment here. I have too many things open. All right. Can everyone see the presentation?
Not yet.
No.
Let me hear.
Oh, there we go.
No.
Looks good.
Okay, is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yep.
All these questions have to be asked. All right. So just as a reminder, because I think we've touched on this before, the 2021 House Bill 1220 added some new requirements for housing elements, and specifically that jurisdictions must plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all economic segments of the population, and then identify sufficient capacity of land for housing those economic segments. Now, as a reminder, our comprehensive plan, as one of its policies and also as part of the goals, was we acknowledged that the housing needed to be affordable to all economic segments in the community, but we didn't actually take the next step, which is identifying how many units and how that breakdown was across the area median income. So what the regulations add are some specific requirements that we estimate the number of housing units needed for moderate, low, very low, and extremely low households. And that's essentially everything starting from about 120% AMI all the way down to 0. In addition, we have to account for emergency housing, emergency shelters, and permanently supportive housing. There are specific numbers essentially that are assigned to us that we have to plan for. We also have to make sure, as part of that, is that we have sufficient land to accommodate all those housing needs across those different median incomes. And what that translates into is there are specific housing types that are probably more likely to be housing those with moderate, low, and so forth income, and it probably will not be single family housing. So it's some mixture of middle housing, again, which is duplexes all the way up to small cottage housing, or multifamily. So we needed to do get some information to make sure that we have sufficient land capacity to identify those things. Another very important thing that we're not going to talk about today, but is part of our ongoing work on the housing element, is that we have requirements now to identify local policies and regulations that result in racially disparate impacts, displacement, and exclusion in the housing, and then implement and identify policies and regulations to undo those. That also includes identifying areas with higher risk of displacement and how to deal with that. We are working with a consultant on that work right now. We hope to have that back to us by the end of the year. So we'll be bringing that into our discussion probably when we have our joint work session with you as the council and the commission at the beginning of December. We'll be touching on housing and land use and development code related issues as part of that discussion. So the good thing is we're not starting from scratch. We do have things in place already that really, so as I mentioned, there are policies that promote housing for a range of incomes. In addition to our comprehensive plan, we have the housing action plan that we developed. We have the homeless crisis response plan. We have all of our work that we're doing with the Regional Housing Council, the middle housing work that we've already done, and all these other things that are sort of already in play as part of that process. So all of that work will be used to build on what we're doing and how we're going to take this information and move it into the housing element of the comprehensive plan and also into our regulations. So as a reminder, this is the sort of the income range and the general equivalent household income, which is based on a 4-person household. The House bill defines these 7 different income levels as things that we specifically must plan for. You'll notice that we're missing the 120% and above AMI on this particular chart. We're not required by the state to necessarily plan for that income group. So when we are discussing this, we're not necessarily forgetting that there's actually a housing allocation, a number of units that are intended for that income group, but they're just not part of the formal process that we have to go through to say identify policies to ensure that we have housing for those 120% and more. Average wage, we sort of talked about how that looks throughout these income groups already. The important thing is that we've got a bit of work ahead of us just to try to meet these particular requirements. The chart here shows the countywide housing need across these different income groups. This again shows the number of housing units affordable to different income groups. The numbers are expressed as a percent of the area median income in the county, which in 2023 was about $102,000. They're over, there are 121,000 plus housing units right now, of which about 40% are about affordable to those with 80% or less AMI. You'll notice that there's a significant number at the 50 to 80%. When we look at that at the city level, I think our numbers sort of shift up to the higher income groups in terms of like the 80% to 100% and the 100% to 120% is really where we are in terms of our housing supply. The overall county need projects that we'll need about 54,000 housing units between 2020 and 2045. This number comes from Commerce. This is sort of the number that we have to plan for. It's not open to debate. And so it's clear from looking at this that there's need is particularly acute for the lowest of the income groups. Really, we're looking at a 70% increase in housing for the very low income groups, a 3-time increase for housing for extremely low income, and 20+ increase for permanently supportive housing, not to mention how far behind we are on even emergency housing. So there's a really significant need countywide about how to address this. So that translates into about 29,000 additional units that will need to be affordable to low income housing, and about 936 that will need to be accounted for as part of the housing unit and bed count for those experiencing homelessness.
Brad, can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
936 for emergency housing actually seems like a teeny, that actually seems lower to me than what I remember when we got this presentation last time, that for this, like we've seen this slide before as part of the TRPC thing.
Mhm.
But that seems low to me. It just given how visible homelessness is, and we know the challenges that we have kind of associated with that. Is that kind of low in part because 936 would assume that we have actually achieved all these other housing targets to where like we don't like this is we need 54,000 homes, and if we actually have 54,000 homes including all these different affordable units below 80 AMI, then we would only need 936 units. But if we're unable to achieve 8,700 units of 0 to 30% AMI, then we would probably need more emergency housing because we have fewer long-term units. So we would have more people shuffling in and out of housing situations, right?
Yeah. Now, I'm not exactly sure how the state arrived at that number, and I'm not sure they had made the assumption that if you meet these other targets for the very low and the permanently supportive housing, that you reduce the overall need for emergency housing. I think based on what we've been seeing from the point in time counts over the previous years and a few other things that the count is probably north of 1,000 in terms of emergency beds that are needed. So
Yeah.
I'd have to do a little more research to figure out how Commerce arrived at that number, but I agree with you that it does seem low based on what we're seeing in the community.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So the House Bill 1220 process had two different steps to it. We worked with Thurston County and the cities of Lacey, Olympia, Tenino, Tumwater, and Yelm. We worked with, we contracted with the Thurston Regional Planning Council to help to facilitate the process and do all the data analysis. The first step again was to identify the housing need for each jurisdiction. Essentially, the question was how many low-income units should each jurisdiction plan for? That's taking the larger number that the Commerce gave to the county and distributing it across each of the jurisdictions. And the second step was to conduct the land capacity analysis to ensure that we had sufficient land to accommodate that housing need. So the jurisdictional housing need, again, the question was how many units are needed in each income range for the housing, for the jurisdictions to plan for. House Bill 1220 allowed the jurisdiction to determine the housing need they were planning for based on some guidelines. First of all, that the process should be multi-jurisdictional and collaborative. All the jurisdictional needs need to add up to the county-wide need, so there's no unaccounted for numbers. And then for us, it was the project partners will ask the TRPC to accept the recommended allocation. So there's a formal process on the region to say that we agree with this allocation and we will follow it. We also, as part of when we started the housing allocation process, this was in the summer and fall of last year, we identified four important goals as part of the process. First of all, it needed to be fair. And by that, we meant that it needs to distribute low-income units across all the jurisdictions. It needs also to recognize the differences among the jurisdictions and how the existing housing distribution would go, and also recognize the needs of community members, especially those people who are relying on permanently supportive housing and emergency housing as part of the process. The second goal was to make sure the process was clear. By clear, that means it's easy to communicate to the public and also to elected officials. It's tailored to the jurisdictions, which also include, in this case, when we talk about the allocation, we're talking about the housing allocation and the land capacity that was done for not only within the city, but also within our associated UGAs. And the uses, and we would use established methods to limit the risk for legal challenges. So we wouldn't try to go beyond perhaps the Commerce guidance too much, but we would also try to tailor it to the community on the jurisdictional level as much as we can. And lastly, the need to have a cooperative process. We would build on what we have right now in terms of a regional housing council, our countywide planning policies and things like that. And it could be supported by all the work group members. We also, and this is also important to understand, that we agreed that the total number of housing units should be consistent with the jurisdictional population, employment, and housing projections that were done by TRPC in September of 2019. So essentially, that was the work that was done for the last buildable lands report in 2021. And the methodology was used as the basis for this work, the methodology itself wasn't changed. It was updated to extend it from 2040 to 2045. And then some minor adjustments were made to it, but we didn't go in and tinker with the formulas essentially to get to this particular result.
Brad, could I ask a question?
Sure.
Some of it is just, the question's really out of curiosity in a way. Are the outlying areas that are part of this, like Tenino and Yelm and those cities kind of around or south, really, I guess most of them, are they predicted to grow at the same rate as the larger cities?
No, actually, and it's interesting. There are a variety of growth rates across the different jurisdictions. For example, Lacey is probably not going to see the level of growth that we're seeing. They're slower. They sort of filled up the area within the city. Their UGA, however, is going to see a little bit of growth, more growth. On the other end of the scale is Yelm, which is really sort of expected to boom because I guess it's the next ring out of the development. So they're expected to have a higher level of expected housing need. The other smaller jurisdictions are sort of in between on that. Some have probably percentage-wise a fairly large increase, but total units not terribly large. There's also other factors that come into play for that. They don't have maybe the size of the UGAs that some of the other jurisdictions have, those kinds of things. But yeah, there are definitely different assumptions for different growth rates across the jurisdictions.
Thank you. Thank you.
So this is, again, low-income housing supply of units for those people and households under 80% area median income, what is currently out there. So for us, we have about 6,128 units. When we add to it the housing expected need, we're almost doubling that by 2045. So as you can tell from the graph, so Yelm, for example, is probably, they need about 3 times as much as they have right now. The other smaller jurisdictions, to different degree, not as great in terms of percentage, but adding 300 units in Rainier is actually still a pretty significant number. So also I'd like to point out the rural number for housing need. Part of the discussions that we had when after we completed the initial run of the housing allocation process, we received comment from the state that indicated that they wouldn't necessarily support our approach of allocating some housing, low-income housing, to the rural areas. And so we made the decision to reallocate those across the different jurisdictions, primarily into the UGAs. So Grand Mound, for example, is a county UGA not associated with any city, but the other UGAs basically took up what had been originally allocated to the rural areas for low-income housing. That's not to say there isn't low-income housing in the county and that there won't be in the future. It's just that we are not planning for it or having processes to allow for it. So based on the allocation, and I'll get to the updated numbers at the end of the process, we then turned our attention to the land capacity analysis. And as I mentioned, the buildable lands report was the basis for making that analysis. We were looking at 2 different questions. One, is there enough land to accommodate the 20-year low-income housing need? And then is the land, that means both what the current zoning of the property is or area and the development regulations are a barrier to low-income housing development, meaning do we allow those kinds of units that were more likely to be developed for multifamily, for low-income households, such as multifamily and middle housing kinds of things. So we did that analysis for all the jurisdictions. We looked at all the different zones. We looked at all the residential uses in all those different zones. We looked at our total acreages across that as part of this process. So the findings that came out of the process was that Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater are urban areas, both the city and the UGA. had sufficient capacity to accommodate future low-income housing needs as has been allocated in the process. Now, I'm going to show you the results for Tumwater so you can see the numbers. We did so for us in a very, in a way that's probably just above the minimum that we needed to do. So I think there's still room for discussion about whether that's sufficient or not as part of our process. Other jurisdictions such as Tenino, Yelm, and Grand Mound were found to have some level of deficit in terms of available land and regulatory things to allow for them to meet these housing needs. So they're actually going to have to explicitly include strategies in their housing element and their regulations to address that. That means likely upzoning some areas, making some changes to allow more uses within their development code and so forth. So again, and I've repeated this a few times, but the House Bill 1220 requires jurisdictions to ensure that our comprehensive plan and zoning aren't a barrier to affordable housing on its own. But on its own, the law itself will not lead to more affordable housing. We can identify all the things that need to be in place and to be cleared out of the way for others to essentially to build the housing. That includes both nonprofits and the private market.
So Brad, for this in terms of deficits, that's like let me just repeat what I think I heard to make sure I'm understanding correctly. The deficits are regarding like regulatory barriers that the city might have in place that we would need to address under the bill. The deficit in our comp plan does not address like our ability to meet those. It doesn't mean that like the comp plan has to lay out a plan for how to achieve those actual units. It means that the comp plan cannot create barriers to actually doing it. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially that not creating barriers is the first level. My suggestion is that I think we do need to include some positive implementation actions to push things along. Even if we can make the argument, hey, we're doing all we can right now, we don't need to change. I don't necessarily think that's the case when we start exploring what we're seeing being built now and how much is being built right now. I still think this is sort of a reality check. I still think we need to do more, even though the numbers indicate we're fine as it is.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like you said, was implementation. I mean, that sort of seems to be the spirit of the bill too, is not just for us to like think about these things, but to help facilitate them to the degree that we're able.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Can I add to that a little bit? So I've had 2 recent conversations with Habitat for Humanity and Homes First of the challenges that they are experiencing regarding permitting and the timeline, right, for developing and creating affordable housing. And so Habitat has worked on a proposal with a neighboring jurisdiction to have like 2 tracks of development for affordable housing. Is that an option? I know I'm serving with Joan and Michael right now in general government, and they both serve on Regional Housing Council. Are there discussions about pulling out nonprofits that are creating and developing affordable housing so it's a streamlined or a fast track to develop the housing that we're looking for because of the feedback that we're getting of the challenges and the delays?
So just speaking, you're asking if there's been discussions about that at the Regional Housing Council level. So there haven't been, but I think that that's not due to a lack of philosophical agreement with concerns that, you know, we need to be able to pivot and do those things quickly. I think that that's more been sort of how the RHC is structured. It's largely an entity that works on approving grants and distribution of funding for entities like Homes First and entities like other affordable housing providers. So we've had a discussion at the RHC level about what it would look like in order for that body to make policy recommendations across jurisdictional lines. Joan, feel free to weigh in too, but I would describe those conversations as still preliminary. there isn't, we haven't gotten to the point where we've achieved a philosophical consensus of we want the RHC to be a body that recommends policies to jurisdictions yet.
Another challenge is with allocating those funds. Homes First and Habitat for Humanity are identifying struggles and challenges with using those funds in a timeline because of the jurisdiction's permitting process and the delays. So that's another issue is you're delivering funds and they are scrambling because they can't meet those deadlines because of other unintended consequences.
Yeah, and that's something that's, you know, more squarely in the wheelhouse of us as sort of the authorizing entity, and then the county is the one who signs off on those things. The nice part about most, but not all of our funding sources is that several of them are unrestricted in terms of timeline. We would be able to hear those concerns and be able to respond to them if it's an unrestricted timeline for the funding. Like, we don't want an entity, we don't want to earmark funding for like 8 years and not actually build anything with it, right? But if someone needs another 6 months or something and they're using home fund dollars that are raised locally and don't come with federal strings, we would be able, I don't think there's anything that would prevent us from granting extensions. To your greater point, I think that's treating the symptom and not the problem, right?
Exactly.
So there are definitely like things that we as an entity here for Tumwater, like we need to look at if we're, you know, if there are ways that we can expedite things and make it easier to help facilitate this. So some of this is in each of the member jurisdictions' backyards that we need to look at. And then the RHC, I would be surprised if there was ever any like, oh, we don't want to grant a 6-month extension. I can't remember a time where we've needed to do that. There's been instances where like projects haven't penciled, like a builder or developer who was trying to do an affordable housing project, like the cost of goods has increased over the past couple of years, right? Like a sheet of OSB is $65 instead of $35 right now.
Right. I
So-
don't want to give extensions, right?
Yeah.
I would love if the conversation with Regional Housing Council is information both ways of, hey, a neighboring jurisdiction is drafting some updated policies to streamline and pull out nonprofits from building homes. What would that look like? Could we look at that? Could we review that? Could we put that as a goal of our comprehensive plan element for housing that we're going to, you know, that's one of our strategies to increase housing is streamline the process for nonprofits. That's what I'm looking for because you have a lot of weight in the Regional Housing Council, right? And what does that look like to bring ideas back to our jurisdiction and say, hey, let's look at this, right? I feel like I know sometimes I frustrate people by asking questions. And again, I just have to go back to council as an ambassador of bringing information of things that aren't working as intended. And I feel it's great intel of something that we can then hear and adapt and modify and evolve. So when we're hearing feedback and concerns from 2 nonprofits, I feel like where does that go in our process? Hearing that and how do we identify a solution and get to a yes?
Yeah.
So I don't mean to frustrate anybody, but I'm hearing intel, I'm hearing information that's valuable.
One of the other things that we do at RHC is it is sort of a forum for jurisdictions to also share ideas for what's working in positive developments in our various jurisdictions. So like if we address that issue and make a change along the lines in which you're describing, that can then be the subject of a conversation at a meeting at the RHC to say like, hey, we had this feedback and we addressed it in this following fashion. We would encourage you to do the same. And I think that we shared back to council, I think we talked about it in a work session, but I could be mistaken because I've looked at the document so many times. I might be misremembering, but we did do, staff put together a crosswalk of development codes across jurisdictions to compare and contrast what are the different ways that we work with, in particular, affordable housing developers, as well as just regular housing development as well, to sort of compare and contrast to see what's available. So like I'd say that the conversation at that level has just always been more informational than action oriented. Like that's just that I'm just telling you that's how it is. I and as the chair am hopeful that that changes in the future. But right now, that's the status quo, is that it would be more of a forum for us to share our victories and encourage others to do the same, as opposed to making a recommendation across jurisdictional lines, because we just don't have, it's just not in our bylaws to be set up in that way. And I'm hopeful that that changes in the future, though.
I can say what I've noticed, that when the word policy comes up, people get cautious, and they also kind of hunker down in, well, this is the work we've done in our jurisdiction, and this is the way, you know. So it's not exactly delicate, but it's you know, it's political, you know, trying to touch other people's you know, rules and regs for doing things. But I agree that I think with what Michael's saying, that under his leadership, I think we can go more the direction, Leetta, that you're talking about. And yeah, so no, I think he well represented how people respond.
Right, so we have a great opportunity, I feel like, to connect to those who are providing the housing, like Habitat for Humanity and Rebuilding Together Thurston County, who's doing the repairs, and Homes First. So they're part of our community. So what does it look like to continue building that relationship and meeting both of our goals? Right? I just don't want to lose them, and I don't want them to still be frustrated and choose another jurisdiction to do the housing, because it's not worth it doing it in Tumwater. I want to avoid that, right? And so I think we have an amazing opportunity to build a stronger relationship.
You're talking about a relationship with each other, or with the nonprofits? Not
With the nonprofits.
a group, but you know, is that?
Thank you. Yeah. With the nonprofits, right? So that they choose Tumwater because Tumwater supports their mission, because we're trying to meet our goals and we support them. Like it's a win-win because we're providing for our community and meeting the needs of our community members.
Right. Okay. Good. Michael will go back and say that.
Thank you, Brad, for allowing this discussion. I appreciate it.
It's actually not my meeting. If you'd like me to lead the meeting, I could do that. No, I'd like to acknowledge Councilmember Dahlhaus' comments. It's definitely something that we've heard in our conversations with not only the nonprofit folks, Trudy and others earlier this year, but also the other builders in the community who are building the overall housing side of things. I think from my perspective, I think there's always room for improvement in terms of how our processing works. One of the things that I've discovered as I've really dove into the work that we need to do to rewrite our development administration chapter, which, by the way, this is a hint of what you'll be seeing in November. It's a very complex process. It's kind of easy to explain the process, and then you start to get into the details of how it actually all fits together and everything else. So I think we're sort of starting down the path of treating the nonprofits and the affordable housing stuff as a separate category, for example, in terms of our fee structure and some other things. I definitely think it's things that we should be exploring about how other ways we can help that. And also look for overall process improvements that help everybody build more housing. I think that's always part of the overall goal of what we're looking for. One of the issues that we sometimes have is each individual project has its own individual issues at times. And especially when we're looking at developing parcels in the land that haven't been built yet, there's a reason why they haven't been built yet. It's likely they have some challenges in terms of critical areas or utilities or other things. And each of those issues is kind of separate and unique to that particular parcel. But yeah, I think more than happy to include implementation actions as part of our housing element to explore those things and to try to come up with ways that we could do that. Okay. So The last slides, I'm not going to go through each of the individual jurisdictions' results except for ours. As I mentioned, we had our allocation in terms of the overall number of housing needs. So what, I'll just walk you through this title. So on the income level and the gray columns, we have all the income groups broken down by the percentages. The second column is addressing the kinds of zone categories that serve these needs. These are things that were identified by Commerce as the most likely kinds of units to serve these particular populations. So for example, for the under 80%, it's most likely that they're going to be in low-rise multifamily. Now, low-rise multifamily means garden-style apartments, 3 stories and less. Like the development on Tumwater Hill is a good example of that. Mid-rise is like the 5-story, 6-story structures that you're seeing come up on Tyee right now. And then we've had ongoing discussions about whether ADUs truly fall into this category or not. Because they're what we're seeing in the market, to be honest, is ADUs are actually the rents that are being charged for those are almost comparable to a full single family. Yelm had a development that went in recently where they built brand new houses, single family houses and ADUs on every parcel. And those individual ADUs were renting for $2,300 a month. So while the ADUs themselves increase the overall capacity of housing, I don't necessarily think they're a vehicle for affordable housing necessarily. So, and then the moderate income, those between 80 to 120%, moderate density housing. Now, moderate density housing doesn't include single family housing. It includes duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, those kinds of things. So the middle housing side of things would be part of that discussion. The third column shows the housing need across each of these income groups. So, for example, the 0 to 30% permanently supportive housing, we would need to provide for or allow for 723 units to be built over the next 20 years to accommodate that. The fourth column shows the aggregate of each of these basically by the zone categories. So as you can see, we're going to need almost 3 times as much multifamily as we're going to need moderate density. What also I want to point out is we're missing on this chapter, this table, excuse me, the over 120%. There's still the housing need for that. The assumption is that would still be provided by single family, probably some duplexes too. But if you're wondering why the numbers don't add up to slightly north of 9,000, that's the reason why. The fifth column, total capacity, is the calculation that was done by TRPC based on our current zoning in terms of uses that are allowed and the actual land that is zoned. That there are factors built into that to account for critical areas. We did account for a certain amount of acreage in the city that would be basically become conservation land to deal with the gopher. But that's the total capacity in terms of units. So as you can see at the very last column, we've got 35 more in capacity than what the need is, which into my mind, the margin of error is way too small to say, yeah, we're fine, don't do anything. We're better off in terms of the moderate income, because again, that's where we've been building already. So my proposal going forward is that we still have to do some work to really make sure that we account for the 80% by a higher factor than what this shows.
Could I ask the question about when we talk about those? I think you spoke about duplexes, triplexes, that kind of model. Those are both accommodate families like those, because there's many of those are single level or whatever for kids, so they can get out and easier to raise a family than being up 3 to 6 stories. And the same thing applies to seniors or to older, people, and because some families are put together with, grandparents and older adults, and then just older folks that do it. Is that part of the conversation, the talking about who would be using these that we build?
Yeah, so you brought up two important things that I think I should mention. That explicitly isn't really part of this housing allocation process in terms of the age groups that will be served by this population, whether it's the senior population or those with families. Another really important thing that's not part of this is, in my mind, when you're building multifamily and you're thinking that it has to accommodate these income groups, that means that those units need to be larger than 1 or 2 bedrooms in size. And you need to figure out how large those things need to be in terms of space needs and everything else, if you're truly going to be accommodating families in those units. So that's really the next step of what we need to be thinking about as we're developing the policies and implementation actions, is how do we encourage, first of all, a sufficient number of bedrooms to be built in multifamily. And then also, how do we address the very special needs of those who need access? And it's, in their cases, it's easier to access potentially on a 1 floor rather than multiple floors. Or if that's not the case, how can we ensure that, that works out better? But yeah, that's sort of the next stage of the implementation side of the discussion.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
And also, when we talk about seniors, we have a tendency to think they're all single, and that's not so either.
That is correct. So the next steps in the process on the larger size, we're going to ask TRPC to approve the revised housing allocations. Essentially, we've already done that on the staff level. So TRPC will be taking that up at their meetings in November and December to formally do that. We will bring all this information into the work we're doing on the housing element. We'll have a further discussion of how that's actually happening at the December meeting with you. We're going to be including specific policies in the housing elements to promote housing affordability and to address deficits, or in our case, I think, make sure that we have a better safety margin than we currently do. We'll touch on that at the meeting in December. We are currently working through some draft policies and goals and starting to work through some implementation actions. So we want to bring that to you in the near future. And then joint planning, we're also updating the joint plans at the same time we're updating the comprehensive plans. And the county has indicated that this year, by the end of the year, they'll have some proposed updates to the development regulations and our UGA, plus updates to the joint plan. What we did when we last updated the joint plan in 2021 is that the joint plan really focused on the land use side, and then all the other elements, transportation, housing, et cetera, were really adoptions of what we already have in the city without amendment. So I anticipate that's going to be a very similar model. When we did the original allocations, we did allocations that allocated housing units to the UGAs and to the cities as discrete, separate things. After discussions, we realized, from the numbers side of things, it made sense, but from the planning side, it didn't. It makes no sense to allocate 3,000 units to the edges of the city when you want to make sure that you're building a community that is has more dense to support transit, that has all these other things, that access is much easier if you build that way rather than send everything to the fringes and hope people can figure out how to get to the services they need. So as part of our housing planning, we're planning for the city and the UGA at the same time, and we're allocating those resources to really sort of concentrate the growth within the city and then have it spread out from there. But not the intensity is going to be much more in the city than it is in the UGA. So are there any questions on what I presented today? I know that was a bit of information.
Questions, additional questions, anyone?
Great work. And we have a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're really just starting.
Yeah.
So, because there's really no way to get you interested in what we're, unless we provide some teasers and stuff of what's coming up. I wanted to mention what topics are coming up at your next meeting. So you're number one, you're prepping and that, but also you really want to come and join us at the meeting. We're going to be presenting our amendments to the Development Code Administration chapter, which is a fairly substantial rewrite of Title 12. That rewrite is driven in part by the need to make some changes before state deadlines kick in and the state regulations take precedence over us on January 1st. Back to Councilmember Dahlhoff's discussion about how we can help change processes and support affordable housing. Those changes in themselves probably won't address that specifically. There are process changes that we'll be talking about that reduce the amount of time that we have in order to issue a decision. Those things will help the process, but there'll be a next step after this particular discussion of how to address the nonprofit affordable housing building.
As long as we capture it somewhere, right? So it just shows the direction, right? And the options.
Yeah, the other important thing that we're currently working through the Planning Commission and discussing all these things is because this is a fairly complex thing and we're doing it in a fairly limited time frame, we recognize that we're going to have to make tweaks to it afterwards.
For sure.
To address issues that we didn't see and that kind of thing. So I think this is sort of the start of the discussion as on those topics. And I think it's something just to keep in mind that, yeah, we're going to have the opportunity to make some changes because we're probably going to need to. Also want to let you know, we're going to be bringing to you our first draft of the conservation element, the full element for you to review. That addresses resource lands. And for us, that means mineral lands, the mine, for example. We have some limited forest lands within the city that are designated for that. We'll be talking about urban agriculture as part of that discussion. And then all of the critical areas are part of that. So just to let you know that, so you'll see, this will be the first element you'll see in total for your review and comment.
I thought of this housing work that we're doing and trying to do and realized that this is being talked about at the level of running for president of the United States of America and talking about regulations and challenging how we get more homes and so forth. So it's going to make a difference, of course, which person is elected the president, but if it's a certain one of them, this is going to be, and hopefully this will be helpful. It won't create a clash in the higher ups and what changes we need to make or something, but will help us meet the challenge of these things. So I think Brad, with your work and your team, I think we're out ahead of this and doing the right thinking here at the right time. And I like what Leetta said too, Michael. I think that this might be a good time to bring this up. There's nothing that we're trying to fight for or any particular project, but to bring up the examples of the nonprofits and things. I think it's a good time. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Brad, for all of this. And when you explain it, I understand it. I've written down, what the heck does something mean? And then just
I hope that level of understanding continues, but if it doesn't, definitely let us know.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. But a couple of quick thoughts. And number one was sort of a news item that I read last month and regarding the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan. And for Kalamazoo, and the article indicated that the housing problem for them 5 years ago was they had abandoned houses that people weren't occupying that were creating nuisances. And in the intervening 5 years, now they're dealing with the issues we're dealing with. They don't have enough housing. They're not doing enough to allow for housing and all those kinds of things. And that was such a strange thing to say, see that, and that just sort of illustrates this is a nationwide problem. There's a whole other things, a lot of other things going on. So I just want to mention that. And also I want to also mention, as part of the housing update work, we're going to be reaching out this month to our housing stakeholders, which includes the nonprofits we talked to back in the spring, to give them an update of where we are and discuss where our next steps and how they can be involved in the process. But I want to make sure to mention that as well.
Brad, can I go back to the conservation element really quickly? When that comes around, is there an opportunity to chat about an example is the development off of Kersop that was clear cut and the wetlands just disappeared and it was continuous and now they're just gone. I don't understand how that project got approved when there's no access to transit, there's no sidewalks, it's a county road, right? And there was a wetland and now it's just gone and it's clear cut under the power lines. I don't know how that got approved because it seems opposite what we're trying to do with conservation. So I'm wondering if that is a conversation we can have in with regards to that element of how did that get approved? I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't know the details of that particular project, but I think one thing that the conservation and critical area protections with under the state law and within our law, there's a couple of nuances. It's not a if you have it, you leave it alone. You can leave it alone completely. There is
Sure.
in there for mitigation and other things if you're not able to avoid and all those kinds of things. And I think that is always again, that's usually a development by development, parcel by parcel specific kind of thing to talk about. But I think just having an understanding of we're not necessarily saying that thou shalt never touch. We just can't do that under state law. And how that, I think we can have a discussion of that.
I would love that, right? Like one of the things that makes Tumwater so special is the urban and rural lifestyles and the compatibility of both of those. So when I see that area, which is a more rural area, and I was like, how do we incentivize other development in other areas in the urban core, right? Where we're doing mitigating taxes and things like that for certain years. And then our rural area, when we talk about agriculture and farmland, I would love to have that conversation of how do we support rural and urban lifestyles and where we want development. Because that's the last thing I want to see is like a continuous wetland. Now it's cut in half in the middle. So how does that impact the rest of that wetland? So thank you, Brad.
Yeah. No, that's an ongoing issue. What's on the ground right now and what is going to be happening in terms of what the overall intent, say, of the Growth Management Act of concentrating growth in the cities and preserving the rural areas out in the county as part of that. When you look at Tumwater, and I agree with you, if you go onto the west side of Tumwater, you can't tell that's city or county, to be honest, because, just large open areas. That unfortunately is not necessarily what it's going to look like as cities develop and more people come into the city. And those changes that occur over time are pretty dramatic. Now, there's huge swaths of wetlands over there and so forth. So those things in themselves will probably remain unchanged for the most part. But just how things change and over time and what the community had looked like 20 years ago versus what it's going to look like in 20 years in the future, that's always a challenging thing.
Right. I just think it comes down to maybe like my priorities are maintaining rural areas and building up on main corridors because that's why my family chose Tumwater 50 years ago, right? So like maybe that is a discussion about strategic goals and priorities is what does that rural lifestyle look like in Tumwater 20, 40 years down the road? And how much of a priority is that for council?
Mhm.
I think another thing we have to pay attention to in our development, and I just heard a really good talk on this, is that everything is going to be impacted by climate change. And there are going to be things that we are going to have to watch out for and possibly change, because anything, I think we feel here a little bit immune.
Everybody froze on me.
I think we need to look at the whole thing and have this whole idea of climate change in our plans, like
Mhm.
the things that you're talking about doing, Leetta, or having wetland disappear or things like that. I think it's just a new thing that in development and land use and so forth, it's just there and it's not going to go away.
I think we will. Like we'll have a standalone climate element, and we're weaving climate change into every element. So I think we are going to have those portions within each element of the comp plan.
Yeah, I've seen that. I think it's really good, and I think we need to talk about it more, maybe, and maybe that's what I'm saying. Not just say it's in our plan, but here's what we're doing here, and this is how we've taken it into consideration. So anyway.
Yeah, and I just want to make a mention on the climate element work that has been done. The consultant and Alyssa have done fabulous work so far. The community outreach has been excellent. Community input they've been getting has been excellent, and I think you're going to like what you see come out of that process. They're moving along at a good clip. They're doing a vast amount of work. So the climate element might be even more developed and in better shape than land use and housing by the time. So you'll have a standard to follow.
Yeah.
The rest of the elements.
That's what you get for hiring good people.
I know. I regret every day when I'm on that interview panel.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our agenda here, and we're right at about 9 a.m. So I think that'll do it for today. Thank you again, Brad, for great presentation, helping us.
Yeah, good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.